I want to thank you for having me here this morning. It's a real joy to be here for a lot of reasons. I wear my emotions on my sleeve, so I'm probably going to tear up a little bit throughout this for a few different reasons. But I grew up in a church like this. Grew up in a very small, very family-oriented church. And it's not something I've had for a while. So even just being here, even just being here and singing these songs was a real pleasure to me. I want to ask, is there anybody here who was part of the place back in the Lambert Park days, back in about 2005, 2006? So around that time, a young man who'd been pretty hurt by church wandered in. And it was a really important time for me. I probably met some of you. I'm not good with faces or with names, so you may recognize me before I recognize you, usually is the case. But a couple years when I was in Victoria, then about 2000, I'm trying to remember, 2005, 2006, something like that, maybe 2004. And being a part of that community at that time, hanging out with James Kingsley a lot, if anybody remembers him, really showed me that church could work, that you could have a community that could love each other and love others. And I know all things change and they don't always stay that way, but for that time it was very, very important to me. So I don't think it's a coincidence that I'm here today. As Paul mentioned, my name is Jordan. I have been involved with the homeless and substance using populations of Victoria and Vancouver for just about 15 years now. I can't believe it's been that long. During that time, I've worked in low barrier housing, in treatment centers, in shelters, in community centers, and in correctional institutions. It's everything from a support worker to an outreach worker, and finally as a chaplain and spiritual care worker. In 2007, I was a Bible college student without a clear direction of where I was going or why I was going there. And in the fall of that year, I was sent into the downtown east side of Vancouver with a bunch of other first-year students. And we went with intention to volunteer and to learn. I left the downtown east side with two questions that I've never found full answers for, but questions that still motivate me today. First, why did I feel like God was closer when I was on East Hastings than I was in my church? And second, what was I supposed to do about it? I knew from that weekend that my fate was tied up with those that were without homes and those that were using substances to quiet their pain. I believed originally that I was called to help the least, the last, and the horribly lost, as I wrote in my journal after that weekend. That desire led me back to the downtown east side in 2009, and I moved into a small room in a 100-year-old building and spent a year living alongside those that were living and dying in that neighborhood. And I quickly learned that I wasn't there to save anybody but myself. I learned that the people living in that neighborhood had hopes and dreams, that they were mothers and fathers and sons and daughters, and that they had faith. And many of them knew the grace of Jesus better than I did. My faith was shaken in all of the best ways. I realized how little I was needed. I realized how much I needed to learn. And I realized that sometimes the best and sometimes the only thing someone can do is listen to another person with care and attention. I left the downtown east side in 2010, but just for a couple of years. I finished my degree, got married, and moved back in the summer of 2012. And since that summer, I have been working continually with marginalized communities. My wife and I lived and worked and had 2 kids on East Hastings, and we lived there until 2018 when we came to Victoria. And for 3 years now, I've been working with Our Place Society, still trying to answer those same questions. Why does God often feel closer when I'm with those who are suffering? And what am I supposed to do about it? And I'm still not sure that I have answers, but I have a couple ideas. So I'm going to kind of do 2 things here. I'm going to talk a little bit about my theological basis for why I do this work and why I feel like it's absolutely vital. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the nuts and bolts. And we're going to have some time for question and answers later. So if you don't kind of get the full picture of what the work that we do, I'm happy to speak more about it afterwards and over lunch as well. Throughout the scriptures, over and over and over again, God calls his people to justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And yet, in spite of this, the people of God seem to continually forget what those words mean. Rather than focusing on creating communities that bring people into relationship, the people of God tend more often to create insular communities with defined roles of who is in and who is out. This has been a central issue for faith communities for about as long as they've existed. And it's not because, I don't believe, because people are greedy or arrogant or snobbish. It's more often because we don't know how to act towards people who we perceive as not like us. It's hard. It's hard to reach across that barrier. It's far easier to follow rules than to engage in relationships. It's far easier to be told what to do than to face someone and see them as a human being. And too often we turn inwards, building our communities, and it's easy to miss the heart of justice, mercy, and faithfulness in the biblical sense. When we think of justice, I think we often get the picture of the Lady Justice, the blind woman holding the scales outside of law courts. We think of justice as an impartial force, one that doesn't get involved in the lives of people, but simply treats all crime or sin the same, regardless of who committed the act or why. God, though, I believe, is neither blind nor impartial. God has a bias. Justice, when used in the context of God in the Old Testament, the word mishpat is usually used. I'm probably butchering that. I'm sorry to any Hebrew scholars in the room. When used in the context of the oppressed, the mishpat of Yahweh is experienced by the vulnerable in the community as justice, the upholding of their rights and the advocacy of their need. For those abusing the oppressed, however, mishpat implied the judgment from God. Justice, therefore, is seen as a leveling of relationships within the community, upholding the oppressed and bringing low the oppressor. The scales of justice must be balanced, but rather than being held by the blind Lady Justice, they are held by Yahweh, the God who speaks and interacts with his people on an extremely personal and situational basis. It is through this twofold action of raising up and lowering down that God is able to level the playing field, creating the opportunity for his mercy and faithfulness to be shown to us. We see this from the very first story in Scripture. I hate that the Genesis story we call it the fall, because I'm not sure that's the best name for it. In Genesis 2:16 and 17, we read that God telling Adam and Eve that if they eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that they will surely die. And we know this story. The serpent lies to Adam and Eve and claims that they will not die, but will in fact be like gods. And they eat of the fruit, and they hide from God and are found out. But rather than death, God shows mercy, throwing them from the garden, but promising hope for the future. The oppressed, those lied to, Adam and Eve, are protected and held up, while the serpent is literally brought low, forced to crawl on its belly. There are consequences, but there is mercy. God, as the saving one, the extender of salvation, provides a way for the relationship to continue by saving humanity. Justice and mercy continually go hand in hand throughout the Old Testament. We read Micah 6:8 this morning. Israel is asked to do justice and love kindness. And Ezekiel goes even further, saying, "See here, this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had majesty, abundance of food, and enjoyed carefree ease, but they did not help the poor and needy." Ezekiel claims that Israel has fallen even further than Sodom in this regard. And Isaiah claims that it is not fasting or worship that pleases. Is not this not the fast that I have chosen? To loose the bonds of the wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. Israel continually fell short of the mark and invested its energy in sacrifice and tithing and observing the law while missing the heart of the law, offering freedom to the oppressed, acting in mercy to those who were poor and broken. They acted as the oppressor by forgetting about mercy, and so were brought low by God. And it is worth noting that every time Israel forgot about the poor and oppressed, every time they failed to enact the justice of God and protect the weak, God sent an army against them. The Holy Land was not promised unconditionally and was taken from the people when they forgot about the poor and oppressed. If biblical justice was completely impartial, if God did not show his bias towards those who are oppressed and poor, and did not take an active hand in the raising up of the oppressed and the lowering of the oppressor, mercy would be impossible. Impartiality leaves no room for mercy. If I stole your coat, it wouldn't make a difference whether I were a millionaire or a homeless man in danger of freezing to death. The partial, relational justice of God understands hurt and struggle and provides ample mercy for those who need it. And today, as much as ever, we desperately need this kind of relational justice. Looking at our home in Victoria, our society punishes and abandons those who are the weakest and most broken. It's easy to condemn the person struggling with addiction or homelessness out of a misplaced sense of righteousness. Often this takes the form of thinking something along the lines of, well, they need to make better choices, or even maybe they deserve it. But the fact is that the vast majority of the people dealing with chronic homelessness and substance use did not choose that lifestyle. Victoria has around 1,500 folks without permanent addresses. Around 600 of those are in what we call transitional housing. These are places like hotels and even custom-built buildings that are funded through BC Housing and managed by organizations like Our Place and Kool-Aid and Portland Hotel Society and others. Another 350, roughly, are staying in emergency shelters. And close to 300 are living on the street in tents and doorways and anywhere they can, with the remainder couch surfing, living in cars, or staying with friends. Most without permanent addresses are dealing with some form of substance abuse. With fentanyl, hopefully I don't have to describe what fentanyl is, but it's an extremely potent opioid, being most common, but also crystal meth, alcohol, and various other substances. Many of these folks deal with dual diagnoses, that is, substance use alongside a traumatic brain injury or chronic mental or physical health condition. At least 50%, but probably closer to 70% of those hardest to house and most addicted are products of the foster care system. Of those that I've personally interacted with over the past 12, 13, 15 years, most suffered severe trauma before ever winding up on the street, and often during childhood. The vast majority of those struggling with addictions that I have met did not become so by making bad choices. They became addicted because every social institution turned its back on them. They were hurt by those that were supposed to protect them, maligned by those that were supposed to support them, and forgotten about by those who swore to remember them. And yet we continually criminalize them, punish them for trying to find some solace when everyone else has turned their backs. And we call them worthless, or worse than worthless, a drain on society. That's not justice. Justice and mercy mean raising up the weak, giving them hope and worth, and it also means bringing low the powerful. As long as we see each other as the haves and the have-nots, as the addicted and the clean, as the homeless and the housed, it will remain extremely difficult to create healthy communities of hope and care. We too often represent everything that they are not. Justice means more than giving to the poor. It means taking responsibility for our lifestyles and the way that we use our things. I'm convinced that people must be more important than things, and that people are not problems. I've taken to saying recently that there is no homelessness problem. There are many hurting people without homes. There is no substance use problem. There are many hurting people attempting to quiet their pain through substances. And I say it this way because it's easier to offload problems to someone or something else. Problems don't have a face. Problems don't have a name. The government loves problems because problems can be solved or more often downplayed through statistics and strategies. But the weightier matters of the law, as Jesus put it, are the relational laws. Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor. And this is intensely personal, and it cannot be offloaded, it cannot be downplayed, and it cannot be manipulated with statistics. Our neighbors are real, living, and breathing human beings with wants and desires and needs, just like us. In Luke 10:25, Jesus answers the question of the neighbor, and he does not answer the question. The question that was asked is not, how should I treat my neighbor, but who is my neighbor? And I think there's a big difference between those questions. Because the answer to who is my neighbor is that your neighbor is anyone who you choose to engage in the act of neighborliness with. There are no boundaries of age, gender, race, culture, or economic status, and this was such a radical idea at the time of Jesus. The idea of reaching across the aisle, of reaching out to those that were the enemy, reaching out to those that were not like you, that were not of your tribe, was a completely radical and revolutionary idea. My neighbor, even if he or she belongs to the worst of my enemies, is the one that I acknowledge and engage with as a fellow human being. But that opens up a new kind of danger as well, where I can now turn my back to my neighbor. Now knowing that my neighbor is anyone that I can choose to engage with, I now have the option to not engage and turn my back, and that is the danger. We do injustice when we begin caring less about who our neighbors are and start caring more about how we look or our church sounds or how polished our presentations are. And looking at this building and knowing the history of this building and this community, I know that you guys are already well on this journey. You're a powerful witness to neighborliness and relational justice, and especially with your interactions with LGBTQ2S communities. This is important because relational justice can only happen face to face. We cannot offload justice, mercy, and being faithful to God onto the state or even onto a charity organization. If we do that, we destroy what it means to be truly gracious and just. Looking someone in the eye is profoundly different than giving clothing or writing a check. And it's not to say that those things are not needed. They desperately are. And if you have any warm coats, we would gladly take them. But they are no substitute for real human interaction. And too often we equate the two things, and we leave it up to the system or to the organizations to do the heavy lifting. And I've found nothing more life-changing than sitting with someone and hearing their story and sharing my own. The danger of transferring mercy and grace into obligation and charity goes hand in hand with justice changing from a relational dynamic focused on healing into a judicial dynamic focused on punishment. I was so glad that we read Matthew 25 this morning. Kind of had an inkling that we would, but I didn't know for sure. I was glad. Those verses tell us that the defining mark of those who follow Christ is in the doing of the acts of feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, visiting the sick and imprisoned, and extending care to the stranger. And I always find it fascinating in that passage that both sides say, Lord, Lord, I didn't know it was you. Right? I didn't even know I was supposed to be looking for you. I was just doing the work. When I began in the downtown east side, I thought I knew what the answer was. I thought if we just treated people like humans, gave them dignity, treated them like equals, that we could change the world. And I still believe that's true. But I also have to acknowledge a growing reality. And that is that since around 2012, heroin has been replaced by more powerful synthetic opiates, in particular fentanyl and carfentanil. These substances are orders of magnitude more potent than heroin and are being mixed with other substances like benzodiazepines and xylazine. And this means that those who use substances are getting sicker and are staying sicker longer. Their withdrawals are worse, their physical health is more effective, and their chances of fatal overdose are higher. This has increased the challenge of this work and has made it more difficult to create spaces where people of various backgrounds can sit and learn from one another. And I wasn't sure if it was my observation, if it was that I've been doing this for too long and starting to get tired, if it was the difference between Victoria and Vancouver. So I reached out to an old friend of mine who works in the downtown east side in Vancouver and has done so for about 20 years. And I asked him just last night, have you seen this? Does this feel different? And the analogy I used is that it feels like the difference between someone waiting for a liver transplant and someone with terminal brain cancer. Both are deadly and dangerous, but one is in a state of waiting and hoping, and the other is in a state of preparing. And he agreed with me that, yeah, it's changed. It's changed, and it's made it so much more difficult. I did 5 memorials in the 5 weeks leading up to Christmas, and I took 2 weeks off, and I came back to planning 7 more. So where do we go from here? And this is a question I'm asking myself as well. And I don't want to make this feel hopeless or despondent. And Carla, I just talked to Carla before, and I said, well, I hope this goes okay. And she goes, oh, it'll be fine. Just don't tell too many sad stories. like, I'll try. My answer to where do we go from here has shifted throughout the years as we've seen this crisis unfold. And there are many factors here that are beyond our control, and even for those of us that have been doing this work for very many years. But there are some things I think that we can do. First, if you are raising families, if you are involved in life, and life is so busy and keeps us so busy in this city, that's okay. We don't all need to go and sit with the poor. We can't. We can't do it. We don't have the capacity. We don't have the framework to do that right now. But you can support those that are doing this work. And that doesn't mean financially. It can mean even by participating in events like we've got Coldest Night of the Year coming up in February, where people can walk and show their solidarity with those that are doing this work. It could be through volunteering, even if it's once or twice a year. Salvation Army has opportunities. Our place has opportunities. There's lots of, I've got, on Thursdays and Fridays, I create a room where people just sit and talk. We put out goodies and hot chocolate, and we just have people hang out. And it's an amazing time to get to know people. Wherever you can, find a way to put yourself face to face with those that are not like you. whether that's someone who is hurting, whether it's a refugee, whether it's someone of a different racial or cultural background. Find a place to sit with someone who is not like you. Second thing I would say is don't look away. If you pass someone who's living rough, smile and say hi. They may scowl back. They may say some choice words to you. That's okay. Do it anyway. Do not underestimate the power of a kind word and a smile. And in all honesty, this is a large part of the work that I do. I acknowledge the person as a person. I recognize that their story is just as valid as mine. I take them at their word, even if their word may not be literally true. I try and give them the dignity of telling their story and listen for the truths within that story. Third, get involved with supporting youth and moms who need help. As I said earlier, the vast majority of the chronically addicted and unhoused come from very, very hard childhoods. And I don't think I can stress this strongly enough. This stuff starts at ages 4, 5, 6. It starts really, really young. There are great organizations that support women and children that can make a huge difference on the next generation coming up. Look at joining Big Brothers Big Sisters and supporting a kid, right? Look at after-school programs. I've got very mixed feelings about church youth groups, but I have way too many friends who would not be where they are today without some crazy church youth group that didn't know what it was doing. And I know I was leading it. I know we're all run off our feet, just trying to keep our own roofs over our heads. But we need to make that a point of solidarity rather than a point of division. In all honesty, we are all in this together. And I think the gap between those who are housed and those who are unhoused is growing smaller and smaller right now. I truly believe that the church can be known to be as the first to love, the first to propose new ways of supporting and finding health for the addicted and the marginalized, and the first to give up some of our luxuries for the sake of others. We just need to keep our focus on those weightier matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Thank you.